A lot of acronyms there, but also a lot of really critical players in the climate data conversation, all coming together collaboratively in order to move towards making key information fully transparent. So where are we today? Well, today I'm really excited because we're announcing our final recommendations for the Net Zero Public Data Utility, where we delineate some of the key data challenges in the climate transition related data space and provide our recommendations for how an open data utility could be designed to ultimately fit into the UNFCCC action tracking system, and also make key data openly available to the public. So the goal of the Net Zero Data Public Utility is to be a trusted and verifiable central source for GHG Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, alongside emission reduction targets and carbon credits. The paper delineates not only the data requirements themselves, but also some content related to product functionality. In terms of next steps, there's a lot to do going from vision to reality, and the climate crisis is not slowing down, so we need to take accelerated action. And so because of that, we have an ambitious roadmap over the next year. Today, we'll also be releasing an RFP for the technical capabilities required to build out a beta pilot of the utility, which we hope to launch within a year's time. So we're really thrilled to make this announcement, and we're very thankful not only for the members of the steering committee, but also the members of many of our advisory groups, our NGO and civil society advisory panel, our financial institution focus group, our assurance and verification focus group, and coming soon, our group for corporates. And I think that just indicates that, as was said along theme, we're seeking to mobilize all relevant actors in the market to really make climate data work, and to have it get to where we need it to get, and have it get closer and closer to investor-grade data as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Simone. I'd like to ask Ian. Ian, we heard a lot in the last panel about the use for this kind of utility for financial institutions, but that's not the only type of actor that would be sort of having interest or use from this kind of information. How do you see this as being of value to the UNFCCC and other public entities?
Thanks, Priya. Great. Well, I think you've probably all heard, like in the rooms this week, that accountability. No.
I didn't hear him.
Okay, that's better. Thank you. Yeah, you might have heard in the rooms this week the importance of accountability, and the fact that we're now, I think, at a critical moment when it comes to the accountability of net zero commitments from non-party stakeholders. And you know, when the Secretary General's response to the recommendations of the high-level expert group is to task the UNFCCC with ensuring the accountability of those commitments, and you know, Executive Secretary Simon Steele takes that on board, you know, it's something that we need to step up to. I was having a kind of a chat this morning with a colleague who were kind of looking, well, how are we going to, they were asking me, how are we going to do this? You know, looking at the tweets and saying, well, how can we do this? This is a huge task. We need a system. You know, we need to work on the system which is universal, that brings in the existing reporting is happening to a central place, that makes it clear to those actors who are reporting where their data is going, that their data is going to end up in a public place where it can be used, where that information can feed into reports and analysis, which is going to drive the parties and is going to be able to be recognized within the UN conference scenarios. How are we going to do this? And I said, okay, well, I've got good news, because if you could come along to the event at 3:30 today, then yeah, we're moving towards a really good collaboration, I think, with a net zero data utility, because I think that's going to really help and support in so many of those aspects. So we're excited for the collaboration in that sense. I think it's, listening to that first panel, I think it's also a really great opportunity here to bring together like the clear and recognized needs from the finance community already, but if we can bring that into that UN process as well, where we can kind of recognize that politically, I think that's a great motivation for reporting. I think it's a great motivation for raising of ambition, and of course ultimately for helping ensure accountability.
Thanks, Ian. That's really good to hear from a UNFCCC perspective how you see this helping the accountability agenda. Now, I'm going to pick up from John's question earlier in the last panel about leading existing examples of work in this space and point to the work of CDP, which has really been pioneering in terms of climate disclosure and data. Nikki, how do you see, what are some of the lessons from the work that you've been doing for decades at CDP on this? And how do you see that work feeding into and collaborating with the Climate Data Steering Committee?
Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Simone and Ian. We're very excited at CDP to be part of this collaboration. And I think the key lessons for us, and I couldn't have agreed with some of the speakers on the first panel more, Swami in particular, about the standardization. I was like, yeah. I think the key lesson for us has been, right, data on its own doesn't magically change anything, right? But you do need the right data, because what you're trying to do is change decisions, right? And first of all, having companies disclose is no small feat. Many of them have been doing it voluntarily. Well, it's called voluntary disclosure, but of course it's on behalf of investors and it's on behalf of big buyers, right? So, you know, you kind of do what your client asks you to do, we find. But that has been critical for creating the space for disclosure standards to come in. And we hope has made it doable so that they can be far, you know, basically our aim is to have, we've collaborated with the ISSB, we formed a partnership, we will integrate the ISSB as the baseline into our system. We're fairly aligned with it already, we've been aligned with the TCFD for years. And of course our system goes further than that, but the aim is to have this be standardized and to be able to feed in and support basically linking the disclosure mechanism to the utility, which we're really excited about. It takes, mainly because it takes time. It takes time to get companies on this journey. In our last year, we've had 3 record increase years. The last year was the biggest jump by far, and of 42%. Interestingly, it was over 60% from Asia. The biggest jump was from Asia, Asian companies, and we now have Chinese companies as our second biggest disclosing country, which is really, really exciting. So that scale can now be at the service of this mechanism and to the aims that you have at the UNFCCC. And we will intend, what we will continue to do is grow it and help make those regulations come into force in a quarter of the time than they would have, because it's become doable for companies and they're already doing it.
Thanks, Nikki. And I think really looking forward from the Climate Data Steering Committee perspective, I know, and everyone who's involved in that, to working closely with CDP on this. Would like to ask you, David, I know there's a lot of discussion around digitization of climate data. How do you see this playing out, and is this an area that you think the utility will be engaging with?
Well, thank you very much, and really a great pleasure to be here and be involved in this initiative. And there was an excellent session actually earlier on digitalization, and some of the people, John Turner from XBRL, David and Liv as well, have been leading lots of fantastic work on digitalization. Before I come on to that, just on why is LSEG involved in this? And I just want to build on some of the points that have been made already around that. So this is very significant. All of the major data and analytics providers have come together, first time, to work together on helping trying to solve this. And we need to solve it because this is becoming an impediment to major action. So there's been that 130 trillion, much vaunted at COP26, of not just investors, but banks, insurers, everyone moving capital. I mean, we see that with switches on things like the FTSE Russell benchmarks. This is now one of the biggest reasons why asset owners are shifting benchmarks, because they want to build climate into it. But if you take large and mid-cap companies, the largest 4,000 listed companies globally, over 40% don't even provide Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions data, and when they do, it's often inconsistent. So we have hundreds of analysts, over 600 of them are working through reports, collecting this data. It's very similar from each of the other providers. This is, and And so we've got mandatory reporting is it will really help solve a lot of this, and we actually are calling on mandatory reporting from governments right the way around the world. By 2025, we'd like to see mandatory reporting on climate everywhere. We'd like to see also green revenue reporting, and in time, transition plans too. But as well as that's going to take some time to come, you've got this consistency issue, which I think this data utility really helps us with. And that is if you come to us, or if you go to any of the peers, you'll potentially get different data for the same company, even if it is reporting. And that's building on some of the points of the earlier huddle. It might be that it's come from like a sustainability report, an annual report, might have come from CDP, might have come from somewhere on their website. The same companies potentially put different data in different places. And we're each also, if it's like 70%, we're having to kind of calculate out the remaining 30 or whatever it is. So, so this potentially can help us solve that with getting a single version of the truth for reported data. So we have, and it's publicly available for everybody. The digitization kind of helps across all of this, as it also means that if the data items are linked digitally, then it means we can hopefully all find the same data item. Puts the onus on the company to make sure that they're not using, where they're linking it up, you'd hope that it's going to be once. It also makes it much more efficient, as you can imagine. It's much more important we spend all this time, energy, and resources actually building the kind of more advanced analytics and the capabilities to help everybody move these assets and to help finance and fund the transition and the rise of green solutions, rather than all this time trying to collect data. So potentially, this could be a very important contribution alongside the standards, the mandatory reporting, and then this really helps us with the consistency.
Thank you, David. And I think that's really important to highlight why you think this is valuable and this is something that LSEG is contributing to. I think it's all the sort of different providers and international organizations coming together on this. Simone, what do you think are some of the sort of key recommendations around the data challenges that this will address and the data the utility is likely to cover?
So, I mean, there's quite a lot of challenges addressed in the paper. So later today you can go to nzdpu.com and read in more detail. But again, I think that there's a few areas. First off, as it relates to consistency of data and driving availability, accessibility, and consistency of some key data points. If we think about building a foundation, we need to focus on the basics first, which are, again, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions data, data on targets, and carbon credits. Why is it so important to go back and focus on this? It's because you have to understand the what before you can get into the how. And as has been described well by David, there's so many challenges still with that information that we seek to address through our work. I think a second area of recommendation we're actually very highly focused on also relates to metadata. Climate data is only as usable as the data that surrounds and describes it. And something else we're really focusing on is how we can allow open access to sectoral classifications to allow for better filtering and use of the data, as well as using open identifiers like LEI to better be able, again, to access this data in a fully openly available way. We think that these tools are really essential, and other partners in this space like OS Climate have already done a lot of work on, again, making these items accessible. And again, I think that from a recommendation standpoint, one of the biggest challenges, as we've discussed, is centralization and providing a central location for this information. I think lastly, and something that we've actually built a lot on in our most recent final publication, is on the concept of assurance and verification. So recently we've heard much more discussion on how can we increase the quality of assurance of climate data. How can we get to reasonable assurance rather than limited? How can we push the needle on verification to really make sure we have high quality data? And I think that the best way that we can drive that through our work is through increasing transparency on those types of fields. So providing users with very granular access to information on where assurance and verification has occurred. I think a key here that we're seeking to do also, though, is encourage rather than mandate. So we need to leave room for every single type of actor that wants to disclose, those that are deeper in their journey, but also those that are just getting started. And the key here is to give them the space to grow and improve upon their disclosure over time, but also allow a user to access the data that matches their preferences as it relates to things like assurance, which correlate to quality in this case. So those are a few of our recommendations, but there's quite a lot, and certainly I recommend that you review our final recommendations, and there's lots of room for increased conversations about these recommendations as we get into our next build phase. So I would also highly encourage any interest to be sent our way. We have lots of different focus groups to participate in that will provide spaces for different types of entities to really indicate their needs and how we can ensure that we're aligning to different types of actors in the market.
Nikki, we heard a bit earlier about the sort of potential that there's lots of other types of work that could be done with this foundational layer of data. Do you have some thoughts on other kind of use cases or analysis that this would be helpful for?
Yeah, I think first of all it's foundational, right? I think that's the key word here. The data and the disclosure that's needed from companies is way more than that, and you've already alluded to that with the transition planning. We haven't got time to have the perfect system. What we need to do is drive action, and so we'll need to have a lot more data quite quickly on forward-looking indicators, and that's why the regulation on this is so important. And I think the foundational layer can start, I think of it as the physics data, right? Does your target match the physics in the system? It's pretty much the basic carbon budget conversation. But there's a lot more that's needed for an investor to know whether a company, if they is transitioning, right, and is actively driving that transition by investing in that company or encouraging it to transition. But I also think that we should never forget that it's the companies themselves who also need data and use this data, right? So for us, one of the biggest drivers of disclosure has actually been the big buyers seeking information, the magical scope 3 of their supply chains. And that has become a mechanism through which they can engage with companies and actually help them to transition so that they too can transition, which is why the scope 3 concept is so powerful. But we should always remember there's a lot of data that they still need that this won't solve. And so it's not just data for investors, and it's not just data for policymakers. There are data flows that need to happen, and that's what folks like Liv and them are focused on, for companies themselves to be able to even report into these platforms.
David, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I would. I think what I'm really hoping this can also achieve is an improvement of engagement between corporates and the finance sector. Because we're never going to decarbonize economies fast enough without very effective engagement between the corporate sector and the finance sector. Finance sector decarbonisation has to support the finance and direct capital towards decarbonisation. Now, we've seen very effective engagement through Climate Action 100+. This is where all of the investors have come together and got very joined up on how they engage companies to say whether or not they're transitioning fast enough and are their targets good enough, and engaging them on going further and faster and making sure that they are, their transition plans are credible. We need that to scale out. So some of the simple stuff is even just get the data out there. So hopefully what this will make very clear is which companies are not even reporting information, and then we can move on to actually, is what they're reporting good enough? And are the transition plans going far enough? That's hopefully where we can get to. But it's that connection between the two sides that I see is so critical.
And Ian, maybe building on that, David talked about connecting the financial and the corporate sector. But what do you think is the value of connecting that then with the public sector and international organizations, and how that comes together?
I'm a bit stumped for a moment. Can you repeat your question?
Yeah. So David was talking about the financial sector and the commercial sector and bringing them together. And I think this also bridges with international organizations like UNFCCC and public sector institutions which are working on regulation and international coordination. How do you think the kind of bridging of that and bringing those three things together adds value and works?
It's a great question. I'm afraid I can't really give an answer to it.
It is a difficult question as well, I know.
It's the golden question. I mean, how to, at the moment, the global, thank you. The Global Climate Action Portal sits on a huge repository of data, which would come from our partners CDP. But it's kind of leveraging that and making full use of that in the processes, the negotiation process, feeding that into the global stock take. I mean, I think this is a difficult question, and it is an ongoing challenge to us, is to actually, find the best way of optimizing and utilizing this. So sorry if that's not an answer, but I think it's a great question, though.
I think that's a great answer, Ian, as well, because I think it just highlights that this is something new for everyone, and it's a challenge that we all need to sort of navigate and work out together, but that we do need this sort of radical collaboration across different types of organizations if we're really going to address climate change and move towards sort of implementation. This COP is all about implementation, and getting that implementation done needs all these different types of entities, and figuring out how we work together is really critical, but also something that we're still figuring out. So I think we're going to wrap up this panel very soon, but I would like to offer each of the panelists either one final thought maybe on what their biggest hope from this initiative is.
That's a big question. Well, I think my first biggest hope is successful delivery in the next year for our beta pilot. But I think from a longer term vision standpoint, something that will also be critical is not only providing this centralized location for access to key data, but also thinking about how we can join into other key agendas, how we link up with mandatory disclosure, how we accelerate the digitization of disclosure, and really take this data to the next steps where it needs to be to allow it to be, again, fully usable, investor grade, and supporting an efficient market.
Nikki?
I think for me, the hope is how it can speed up digital alignment as fast as possible so that our data is aligned digitally, because we're not going to have all the standards aligned at the sort of substantial level, but this provides a mechanism through which we can speed up on that alignment, or at least interoperability. Yeah.
As I said, I think it's about getting the single sort version of the truth. I think to achieve that, one piece also which we'll need to get right will be the actual, also the independent governance also of the platform itself. And so I think that's going to be a really key thing as well for the future.
I think the big challenges are kind of well stated, but I think what I would like to see, and this was touched on earlier, how this can kind of help move forward some of the associated challenges, those metadata challenges kind of thing, which I think have held us up a lot in the past in terms of understanding what is what and who is who. So I think I see the opportunity here of really advancing that. I mean, I'd also like to see and hope that it kind of grows beyond purely a corporate accountability tool. I mean, it needs to be, indeed, if it's going to feed into a UN climate change global data portal, it needs to be global data. So we need to look beyond those corporate entities to the subnational space and beyond that.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. I know there's a whole other area of very important work beyond sort of climate transition data for financial institutions and corporates that you're working on, and have lots of other sort of events on this week as well around lots of other areas around sort of resilience and adaptation and subnational actors. So all of that, incredibly important agenda as well. With that, I would like to thank all my stellar panelists for joining us, and thank everyone who has been involved in the initiative in various ways for all their contributions so far, and invite Arnab Ghosh, who is the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and also a member of the UN High-Level Expert Group on Non-State Actor Commitments, to join us for some closing remarks and talk a bit about how this work links to the HLEG recommendations, which were released earlier this week. So thank you everyone here, and thank you in advance, Arnab, and thank you everyone who's in the audience as well for being here.
What's your review of the thing?
Well, I know we are running short of time, but Priya asked me to weigh in on this panel and the session. And of course, we've released 2 days ago the recommendations of the high-level expert group on the net zero commitments of non-state actors. I hope you can hear me. I'll bring this a little closer. But I want to only deliver 2 messages. The first of which is that a metaphor where we are sitting right now perhaps makes sense. Data needs to cut through the noise. And I think what is happening right now is that we have a lot of data out there, and it's very difficult to understand what is good, what is credible, what is usable. So when we think about COP27 and all the things that we're trying to do as action-oriented, one of my mentors once told me, if you're trying to get action done, you're going to answer a few basic questions. Why, what, how, who, where, when. So as I've sat through, listening through a lot of the issues that have come up, I ask myself, are we clear about the why? And I think that is pretty clear-cut, even in the H-leg recommendations. When we set out the problem statement, we said it's difficult to understand if non-state actors are on track to meet their net zero commitments. The data that is available is not standardized. It's making it hard to compare progress between non-state actors. And many of the voluntary initiatives that we see have imperfect systems of reporting and of course also holding their members to account. So the why is fairly clear, and nevertheless, I would urge that those of us who are in the room, including those who just left, ask who's not in the room, who's not going to be convinced by this why, because you'll still have a huge number of people. I think the very first data point I got, that there are only 80 companies that could even provide the information that would serve as the baseline itself is problematic when we're talking about hundreds of millions of entities that have to be governed. That said, then we get into the what. So in the H-leg report, we outlined that some clear recommendations that non-state actors must annually disclose their greenhouse gas data, their net zero targets, and their plans or progress towards those targets. It needs to be standardized, open format by public platforms, verified by independent third parties, but also at the same time build the capacity in developing countries to boost this data availability and make sure that the disclosures are accurate and reliable. So a lot of what I've heard today actually already begins to respond to some of that what that we've asked for. But we also ask for some more specific things to be designed, you know, whether it's the template and standardized template across the different voluntary initiatives, verifying the information in the right format, encouraging that independent evaluation, but also linking it up to broader processes, annually reporting to the FCCC, Global Climate Action Portal, so that there is the state actors and the non-state actors that can be talking to each other. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but I begin to see a lot of the what as well, which is where we come to the how. Of course, in addition to, and of course we draw attention to the net zero data public utility, we also ask for other things to happen. We ask for an assessment to be undertaken to the extent which various standards, so there's the ISAE 3000 sustainability assurance and the ISAE 3410 for greenhouse gas statements, are fit for purpose for providing that assurance. We also ask for the Net Zero Financial Services Providers Alliance to actively support SMEs in developing countries that have limited resources, so we keep raising the bar and raising the standards. But this is where I finally get into the who, and I get excited by that long list of acronyms that Simone outlined. You've already got a lot of partners. But that's the who on the supply side of the data. And I was sitting there and asking myself the who on the demand side. Who all could be using this effectively? And some of this we already heard. Nikki said that, you know, it's also the companies themselves for their vision and their execution towards their plans. Earlier, Swami said, talked about the investors and the link to risk assessments. We've also outlined in the HTech report how consumers may reward the companies that are adhering to these higher standards. But there are two other aspects of this use of the data, the who, that I want to draw attention to. One is peer learning and peer review, and the other is the ambition loop to raise the standards. And I think we need to be thinking over the next year, as we move towards the global stocktake, how can this information, as credible as it gets, help to actually encourage that peer learning, but also peer review and nudging each other to raise that ambition. The final set that then comes to is the where and the when. I think the architecture that you're designing is really exciting with the data public utility, but we need to, as we outline in our report, we need to be able to accommodate these different levels of reporting capacity. It should be accessible to users across the board, across geographies, and should be consistent with the broader, as I mentioned earlier, the FCCC and the Global Climate Action Portal. So some kind of convergence needs to happen there. Final point then, when? There's a lot to be done, but I want to provoke you that there are two whens that we have to answer: the pathways to action and the pathways to accountability. How will the data that we improve help to accelerate that pathway to action? And how will the data that we improve and make more credible and more usable and more salient may help us to accelerate the pathway to accountability? If we don't get to those two endpoints, the rest kind of just sits there without encouraging or raising the trust that is needed. So all that is to say, I took a while to give you that one big message of data needing to cut through the noise. So I'll conclude with my second message, and I'll quote something from 131 years ago. In 1891, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote A Scandal in Bohemia. So if we want to avoid a scandal in our net zero targets, we've got to do what Sherlock Holmes said in that book. You see, but you do not observe. So we are seeing a lot of stuff out there. We need to improve our methods and our processes and our collaboration, the radical collaboration, to observe a little bit more closely, to raise the ambition loop, to hold each other accountable. Thank you for having me here, and congratulations.